We have one more panel before we convene. Three more speakers before we convene in the panel of all of our speakers from these two sessions. So this next panel of three is talking about integration of data for risk assessment. And to start this panel, we're going to focus on the entity that focuses exclusively on risk assessment at US EPA, the IRIS program, the Integrated Risk Information System. And they have the huge challenge of consistently generating usable regulatory risk assessments while at the same time moving forward to adapt and adopt integrated new methods. So I think that you will be impressed at the data integration going on in that program. But we'll also look in this session at the advantages and challenges of shared data for risk assessment, including chemical repositories, biorepositories, and databases, as well as a description of the Risk 21 project that attempts to integrate and standardize an approach to risk assessment. And all of that will be great food for thought for the panel. So our first speaker on this panel is Kris Thayer, the Director of the Integrated Risk Information System at the National Center for Environmental Assessment at US EPA. Thanks, Kris.
All right, thank you. So I thought after lunch we'd do a bit of a curveball. And so we're going to move from thinking about evidence integration in the context of big data to think about evidence integration in the context of a human health chemical assessment. So here we're talking about integrating information from different lines of evidence, each with its own special complexity that often varies from chemical to chemical. So integrating evidence from human studies, animal studies, mechanistic studies, which are often but not exclusively drawn from in vitro or high-throughput screening approaches, considering modeled evidence. So looking at all of this in the context of a chemical assessment. So I also wanted to talk about, so again, this would not really be, I think, consistent with the big data discussions that we've been having previously, but I want to sort of forecast some of the ways that we're changing the way that we collect and disseminate information for these assessments that I think in the long term may make this more of a big data kind of evidence base. Okay. All right, so as mentioned, I direct the IRIS program. IRIS does chemical assessments, human health-oriented assessments. They reach conclusions about hazard and then go on to derive toxicity values. They get used by others. And I've mentioned a few important laws at the agency, the Clean Air Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, a few Superfund regulations. TSCA, right now, what we're trying to do is as we get our bearings on systematic review methods, we're trying to share any advice we can to our TSCA counterparts so that they can bring those to bear on doing chemical assessments under what's a very punishing timeline. So IRIS assessments are conducted using systematic review methods. So here's an often used definition from a 2011 Institute of Medicine report. A systematic review is a scientific investigation that focuses on a specific question and uses explicit, pre-specified scientific methods to identify, select, assess, and summarize the findings of similar but separate studies. So I use this definition a lot because a lot of people use it, but I always trip over this one, similar. I have yet to see an assessment where we're actually looking at very similar studies. And just a little bit of context. So as we've embraced in environmental health systematic review practices, we keep in touch with our counterparts who are doing this for healthcare. And so just a little bit of perspective on this similar. So there was a survey I recently saw, and this more from the healthcare side, about when would it be appropriate to compare controlled clinical trials with observational studies. And most people said you would only do it if they didn't have the controlled trials. And so here, and that's very different from what we're doing in environmental health. We're taking every nugget and sometimes taking too many nuggets to try to create stories. So here's a schematic. In 20 minutes, I'm not going to do a deep dive over a systematic review. But here's a sort of a schematic that that indicates that systematic review, I would argue, covers everything from the problem formulation to how you identify your evidence, how do you evaluate the quality of individual bits of evidence, and then how do you look across studies to do evidence synthesis and integration approaches. And then from there, and that would sort of take you up to the hazard identification part. And then sort of probably less systematic review methods about how do you go from there toward deriving toxicity values. So I'm going to be focusing mostly today on evaluating evidence and synthesizing it, but I did want to sort of give an acknowledgement to Lance's comments earlier about the importance of problem formulation and identifying your topic. You know, I think for people who don't do systematic review, it can appear very daunting, but I think once you understand a lot of the process and methods, it's actually much more efficient because you have to think very specifically about the decision-making context of your question. And that has a direct impact on how do you screen studies for relevant. Relevant, not, maybe supplemental information. And so, you know, it's that sort of measure twice, cut once approach. And I think there is a huge amount of efficiency that's brought to bear in a systematic review because you put so much emphasis on thinking about what is your problem. So I guess sort of the punchline, evidence integration now, again, across all those evidence streams, is typically qualitative. Within the IRIS program, within others, there's usually some sort of conveying of how confident you are in the hazard conclusion that comes from that evidence integration. Within the IRIS program, not just us and others, we're exploring quantitative methods of doing this, but I would say that they're still largely in sort of a research mode. So again, I mentioned that I was just going to do, I'm not going to do a deep dive into systematic review, but for those of you who are interested in things that I sort of only cover on the surface here, just a few weeks ago, there was an NAS workshop to give feedback to the IRIS program about advances they've made in systematic review and also quantitation. And so I would just refer you to the meeting materials for that, sorry. Uh-oh, no, not what I do. Okay. I would refer you to that URL link, and you can see slides. You can also see posters that demonstrate application of some of the systematic review methods. Okay, so for internal study evaluation, so we use sort of a same general approach for animal studies and human studies. It's sort of a domain-based approach, and I'll show you what that looks like. But right now, what we're trying to focus on is really sort of, do you believe the findings of these studies? So it's really focusing on internal validity, sensitivity of that experiment to find something, as well as reporting quality, but really not reporting quality for reporting quality's sake. It's really reporting quality to the extent that can I make determinations about internal validity based on whether the study has been sufficiently reported. You'll notice that there is not questions here about applicability of the evidence. So in systematic review, applicability, how relevant is the study to your question, would be something that you would characterize up front. If it's not relevant, you don't include it. And as I'll show you later, when you're doing the evidence integration, it could be that you have information that's relevant, but maybe it's not as direct as you'd like it to be. And so there's a place later in the evidence integration where you get to convey that judgment. But, and I'll say this a few times, when we're looking at individual pieces of evidence, the focus really is to try to separate out decisions about internal validity from applicability. So here is just a schematic of some of the domains that we consider for experimental animal and epidemiology studies. So for epidemiology studies, I think these are very, very familiar to people who do this kind of analysis, questions about confounding, exposure measurement, sensitivity. In the animal realm, so these would be sort of broad domains, and for example, under selection or performance bias, you would probe about whether there was randomization, whether there was blinding at outcome assessment. So each of these domains has signaling questions that help the rater reach domain level decisions. So it's not a numerical scoring approach, it's a domain-based approach. And the idea is that the rater considers each of these domains and comes up with a judgment. In this case, everything from critically deficient to good. And then you would consider all of those domains and come up with judgments about overall study rating, everything from uninformative to high confidence. So here might be an example of a medium confidence study. This would be an epi study, I can tell from the fields, where you can see things are mostly green. There were some issues with the exposure assessment, which probably is the reason why it landed with medium confidence. Here's maybe a study that might, based on this domain approach, be considered uninformative. So when we're doing our analyses and you have an abundance of medium or high confidence studies, you would not likely use the low confidence studies, and the uninformative studies you would really not use those at all. Okay, so that's sort of a critical piece, is understanding the quality of your individual pieces of evidence, so that now when you move into evidence synthesis and you're looking across studies, you can come up with judgments about your confidence in those studies. So it's important to note that synthesis of evidence is not just counting the number of positive and negative studies. It should be informed by thinking about the bias, the risk of bias, or the internal validity. The sensitivity, is that study designed sensitive to detect an effect if present? It should also be, again, when possible, to base it on studies of medium or high confidence. And sometimes you don't have that. I mean, you focus on your best available evidence. So if you don't have an abundance of medium or high confidence studies, and all you have is low confidence studies, then that should be conveyed subsequently when you're expressing your confidence in the body of evidence. And we'll come to that later. So these are just some things that we think about. I mean, because you often get studies, you have them extracted, and now you're probing for patterns, right? And so these are some of the common things that we probe, patterns across populations, whether it's in the human studies across general population or occupational studies. In the animal realm, are there patterns based on species, life stage, route of administration? And so here, now, again, this is sort of leading up to, now we're moving into evidence synthesis. And right now we're thinking about trying to look at different lines of evidence, human and animal, sort of separately, and reaching conclusions about how confident we are on those individual lines of evidence. So one input right now are sort of the study evaluation conclusions that, again, are assessed at the individual study level. And now we're moving into sort of adapted Hill considerations. I know this came up before. So we're going to go through these, not in any detail, but I think in response to some of the comments earlier, I would think that these domains would apply to some of the big data questions that we have. But that's something that perhaps we can sort of discuss during the discussion session. So consistency. It's probably self-evident about what you're thinking of, but in the context of articulating your confidence in a body of evidence, you might have increased confidence if you see inconsistency. If you have explainable inconsistency, you don't necessarily decrease your confidence. It's when you have the unexplainable inconsistency. And I would also point out here that this is sort of an across the body of evidence judgment, but sometimes your body of evidence might only be one study. Effect magnitude, precision, biological gradient, dose response. Again, I think probably concepts that everybody's very familiar with here. Coherence, so a bit different than consistency. Now you're maybe talking about sort of kind of related but different endpoints. And again, this is something that might apply to thinking about within human or within animal, but again, it could be sort of an across different lines of evidence. Natural experiments and temporality, although again, sort of we use the Hill considerations a lot because they're very familiar to people, but I think there is this idea that, at least in some systematic review groups, that not that they're outdated, but maybe when we think about how they're operationalized, they could use a little bit of dusting off. So, for example, the concept of temporality would be something that we would probe often at the individual study and evaluation phase. And I just going back to that comment, not trying to say that they're not relevant, but there's a lot of methods work on how do you operationalize those concepts. So the idea is that they might generally apply to whatever question you have, but the way that you would implement them, if you're talking about animal evidence, big data, might be different. And then mechanistic evidence is often it can be considered in the context of how it helps you inform your within body of evidence judgments, as well as across body of evidence judgments. So here are just some highlights about how do we think about the mechanistic information. One, it could be a big one, is thinking about the human relevance of animal data, the mechanistic information, again, which often comes from in vitro or high throughput screening, studies, but not exclusively, can also inform judgments about biological plausibility. It can help with extrapolation, whether you're talking about from high to low or short to long duration. So for evidence synthesis, we're now, again, looking at the results of human studies, animal studies, and we're thinking about mechanistic information and the way that it informs those judgments. In our philosophy is that mechanistic information, especially if you have robust phenotypic evidence, it's not required. It's kind of a nice to have if you can tell that story. And then moving on, we think about evidence integration. So here again, our inputs, we've assessed study quality at the individual study level for human and animal evidence. That's one input. And then these would be the factors that we think about that we've already shown on the prior slide. I say it here because in our systematic review protocols, we try to give guidance to our teams about what does consistency look like? What is evidence of an exposure gradient? So I know you can't read this, but this might be one way that you would try to disseminate that. So if you could read it, what you would see would be that I've got indications here. This would be an evidence profile table where you're trying to summarize the body of evidence, the number of studies, the quality of those studies, the factors that increase or decrease your confidence, what was found. So here we've got rows for human studies and animal studies, and this is all anchored around male reproductive toxicity of one of the phthalates. And so for the human studies, again, a description about which studies they were. In bold, if you can't read it, would be indicating those that were low, medium, or high confidence. And then outlining factors that increased your confidence across those collection of studies, factors that decreased, and then some confidence assessment using some symbols. I think in our approach, it goes from inadequate to slight to indeterminate to slight to moderate to robust. And in this case, the way that this worked is that the individual confidence in different types of male reproductive effects, testosterone versus reproductive organ weight, you might have had different conclusions there, but they were all wrapped up into a conclusion about male reproductive toxicity. And the same for human. And then there's another column in a table like this that outlines your judgments for looking across this evidence stream. So the relevance of the animal model to human, for example. And then you would come up with an overall confidence assessment. So this is referred to as a structured framework. As you can imagine, this is very expert judgment based. And so in our workflows, we try to facilitate people doing this exercise independently and then resolving and coming to consensus. I'm not going to talk about the quantitative approaches, in part because they go over my head. But I will say that we are thinking about more quantitative approaches, whether it's trying to characterize the uncertainty, whether it's trying to integrate evidence within an evidence stream, or even trying to integrate across evidence streams. And again, I would just refer you, if you're interested in more of this, to some of the posters that are available online to show more of these methods that were presented at the NAS meeting. So now I want to just spend a few minutes talking about data content management. So I'm going to talk a little bit about HAWC. It's probably very familiar to some of you here, maybe others not so. Basically, it's this web-based, free, open source software application that helps facilitate chemical assessments, doing everything from facilitating the screening of studies for relevance, evaluating the quality. And what I'm going to show you today is sort of how do we summarize the findings from the included studies in a way that I think helps facilitate and repurpose what we've done to make it more usable to the field. So this is an example of, and just this is all human. There's nothing automated about this. But as a data extractor, in this case, you're looking at an animal study. So you would be prompted to input chemical names, purity, sort of basic features that we often summarize in assessments. We also have fields to characterize endpoints. And you might not be able to see it from here, but there's the endpoint name. And there's 4 levels from system to an effect subtag that we can think about when we're trying to apply some of these ontologies or terminologies. This is kind of free text autofill, so a bit like in Excel. You start typing in a word, and if somebody's used it before, then you can see it on the menu. But we were very, very keenly interested to try to sort of make sure whatever terminology we use here is consistent and promotes looking across different databases. Here's an example of, we also use HAWC because we think it's going to help us with visual representation of the evidence, to look at patterns of findings. So the actual text in the assessment is more focused on evidence synthesis and integration conclusions and not on summarizing individual studies. So here's an example of an epidemiology study that's summarized in HAWC. And if you click, on this case, on the outcome, then you get this click to see more. Here's some animal evidence from chloroform fetal survival. So you're looking across studies. There's 4 studies here. I can click on an endpoint. This is live fetuses. And then again, you sort of see more of the click to see more. You can also visualize the findings by effect size, like percent control, which helps get away from reliance on the statistical significance when you're looking at patterns of findings. And then you can also access the determinations made about individual study quality assessment. And you can download the extraction. And it's granular enough that you can do a meta-analysis on it. So this is for epi studies, in vitro studies, animal studies, and it also includes the ability to download the judgments. So just some parting thoughts. Systematic review places a premium on understanding the decision-making context. And that helps determine what is the best available evidence. The analysis of the quality of individual studies is, I think it's going to be challenging for the complex data types of the kind that we've spoken about here. Again, the philosophy would be to try to separate out internal validity from reporting quality, from applicability to a question. And I think we've mentioned this before about how do we think about big data in the context of thinking about Hill considerations or structured frameworks for reaching confidence. And I think that this is an area that is worth pursuing conceptually. There should be a lot of applicability, but a lot of times it takes case examples and hands-on experience to find out whether these frameworks will apply. So I would say that there's not too much happening now in systematic review on that front. And then I think in terms of the HAWC, there's one about sort of thinking about entities that do literature analysis, and if everybody could have a structured approaches for summarizing information, then we can look across. But I think there's also opportunities for thinking about where do we flip the publishing model. You know, some of these tools, web-based free, potentially, you know, maybe authors stop presenting everything in tables and paragraphs, and if there could be sort of this more structured entry on the front end, that it would make life much easier on the back end to look across studies.